All right, so this is actually, perhaps you guys had the opportunity to participate in an earlier webinar where we went through value mapping as a critical business architecture viewpoint, and so this is really kind of a continuation of that, going into the key internal business architecture viewpoint capability mapping. This is all, quite a bit of this content, again, as foreshadowed earlier, comes out of the BizBoc Guide, which is the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge, and version 6 is the latest release that we came up with about a month or so ago, and we release at least 2 versions per year. But you know, the foundation of the framework is pretty stable and has been for quite some time. That the idea that we want to think of business architecture with 3 different perspectives, namely the idea that ultimately what we're trying to do is build a business architecture knowledge base, and this often would take the form in some organizations as some sort of modeling repository where all of this content is very rigorously managed using some kind of modeling tool, and the idea is that there are 2 groups of content that we tend to care about. One called the core foundational content, and that is shown in the yellow circle in the middle: capability, organization, information, and value. And then the idea that there are extension domains that, depending on your circumstances and what you're trying to achieve, you may want to describe other business architecture perspectives that have to do with stakeholders, policy, strategy, product, and initiatives. And the differentiation between the two is a couple dimensions. The core foundational content is that stuff that is almost always going to be germane to any type of scenario that you might find yourself in, and it tends to be less volatile, generally speaking. So once you come up, for example, what we're going to talk about today, a capability model, it tends not to change very dramatically over time, except for some particular circumstances, like you decide to go into a whole new different line of business that might require a change to your capability model. Where the extensions that are in the orange circle that surround it, those not only may be optional because of the different scenarios that we find ourselves in, but they're also perhaps more volatile. They change more frequently just because of the course of doing business, changing strategy, determining how we're going to deliver upon that over time. But the idea is that we just don't want to populate a knowledge base because we can, or we have a tool that lets us do it. We want to contextualize that in the context of different scenarios. And so the BizBoc Guide actually identifies 12 common scenarios that are very obvious good uses for business architecture practices, and those would be things like a merger and an acquisition, or a joint venture, or operational cost reduction, or simplification, or new product rollouts, or transitioning to a customer-centric business model. So there's good guidance within the BizBoc Guide that provides some hints and tips about, well, if you find yourself in this scenario, here are the core and foundational domains and extension domains that you may need to make some investment in. But the whole idea is that the knowledge base, again, is ultimately a repository. And so we want to provide views into the content that's in that repository through a set of business architecture blueprints. And there's at least 1 or 2 blueprints for every domain. A map that, in this case, we're going to take a look at capability maps initially, and then a cross map, which has to do with how does that concept relate to these other domains. So we're going to take a look at not just capability maps, but then once we have a capability model, how do those capabilities intersect with things like organization, information, value, strategy, initiatives, so on and so forth. But the idea is that, again, what types of blueprints we create should be derived from the scenarios that we find ourselves in, so that if we're going to go to the trouble to, populate a repository with this content and share and create various diagrams and possibly other forms, matrices, and tabular reports, that those are addressing the concerns that the stakeholders have in those different scenarios. So what is a capability map? Again, quite a bit of this content comes out of the BizBot guide. So it's defined as a concise, non-redundant, business-centric view of the business at its most fundamental, rudimentary level, where a capability is defined as the capacity that an organization may possess to achieve a particular outcome. So just FYI, I don't like using the word ability in the definition of capability, since it's, they're very similar terms. So, and I think capacity is really the better noun, because capabilities, you need to have capabilities in your capability model, irrespective of whether you're doing them well or not, or whether you do them or not, because they could be done by partners, or things that you should be doing but you're not doing them yet. So again, I think that potential capacity is really an important part of what a capability represents. But ultimately, capabilities describe what an organization does or should do, but not how it's done. That tends to be more of a process-related question. When it's done, where it's done, or who does it. So that's where we get into this concept of cross-mapping once we have a capability model. So again, the capability map by itself is really, in some ways, very simple. I don't want to suggest that it's an easy thing to do, but the concepts of what make up a capability map and the elements that populate it is pretty straightforward. But it can take, again, a non-trivial amount of time for an organization to converge on an agreed set of capabilities across the enterprise. The interesting thing about a capability map, and this is somewhat different from many of the other blueprints in the business architecture framework, is that ultimately a capability model by itself isn't very interesting, to be quite honest. Namely, it gains its value when you map it from other things, like we talked about earlier. So, and we'll see some examples of that as we go through this. So, from kind of an enterprise architecture perspective, we can think of a capability model as a reference model. Namely, it is a taxonomy that is used to classify things. But until we start using it to classify things, it's just a classification scheme. And that's an important point to bring up, that you're not going to know if your capability model is really good or not until you start mapping it to other things. Because in a vacuum, you'll look at it and all the words and everything might make perfect sense, but then when you start rationalizing it by mapping it to processes or organizations or IT applications, that's really going to provide a good dimension to help you determine, did I name the capability correctly? Is it grouped correctly in the hierarchy of the taxonomy? But ultimately, even though it is a reference model, it is a really important part of establishing a common vocabulary for the enterprise, so that when we talk about things like strategy and initiatives and information and organization, that we can always correlate it back to the same terms that we use to describe what are we trying to describe. So, and you'll see some examples of that as well in just a little bit. But we do, especially in complex organizations that may have grown through mergers and acquisitions, that have business units that are segregated upon product lines, it does allow us those organizations to have local terminology that makes sense to them, but then map that to a common set of terms across the enterprise. So if there happen to be 4 different business units that are ultimately trying to do the same thing, they may call it a different thing in their local space, but if we map it to the same capability, we now have transparency and visibility across the enterprise that, in fact, they are doing the same thing, even though they may use local language. Just like everything in business architecture, we need to make sure that we consider the scope of quote-unquote